I feel like I've really graduated now because I really don't like calling on my. So I guess if you survive 3 or 4 nights or whatever, you get the wireless. So thank you for that. And thanks for coming out. As Dave said, it's it's really nice out there. I thought about maybe calling in sick, but anyway, those of you that are here, congratulations on really being serious about this topic. And of course, we're taping it in case folks want to go back. Dave said, welcome to week 4. We're going to talk about threats to liberty. Before we get into that, I do want to summarize and cover really the ground that we've reviewed over the last 3 weeks. First point here is that the whole point of this series has been to build a biblical case for liberty and why liberty is important. I think a lot of us have heard stories our lives off, maybe more than others, but we've heard stories about patriots and some of the wonderful things that they did. We know the founding of our country was pretty difficult, if not a minor miracle. And that's all great, and that inspires us. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of folks out there that just don't buy it. And there are a lot of pastors and leaders in church, or even people that have been believers for a long time, that really have not had the compelling rationale, the argument for why America was founded as a Christian nation. And there are lots of reasons for that. One of the key reasons is that the information that's so critical to help you understand that has largely been suppressed. And we're going to talk about that tonight. But our goal really is that you would all have a firm handle on what's the biblical case for America's founding and really the blueprint for American government. We all should know that. And I think as the years roll on here, it will become increasingly important for all of us as Christians to really know our faith and be able to defend it with resolve. So that's the whole reason that we're doing this. So the first key point I talked about was the idea that God gave us the institution of government. I think our society thinks that maybe man came up with this idea, and that is not the case. After God created Adam and Eve, incidentally, the marriage of Adam and Eve was the first institution God gave us. They were in the garden. We all know the story. They ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They got kicked out. Mankind had about 1,500 years where they used their conscience to guide their behavior. And God's assessment after about 1,600 years was, he looked around and what did he see? Nothing but evil. Every inclination of the heart of man was only evil all the time. And then later on he said that the world was filled with violence. And so what did he do? He sent the flood. But then the question is, what would cause things to be any different? And the answer was, God gave us the institution of government. Why? So that we could keep evil in check, and we could have a stable and productive society, and hopefully get on about the business of coming to know God, growing in our faith. And that's really the point of government. It's a God-given institution, the second institution he gave us, and the whole intent is to protect our religious and civil liberties. Third, we talked about the fact that the idea here is that everyone has the right to pursue living up to God's moral law, as summarized by the what? The 10 Commandments. That's a summary. You could summarize it further by saying, remember Jesus said that the rich young ruler came to Jesus and said, what must I do to be saved? What did he say? Keep the commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. And the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. So he just summarized the first 4 commands, which is love God, and then the latter 6 commands, which is love your neighbor. And so that's the point. And we all have a right to then aspire to live up to that standard. That's the whole reason God gave us the standard. He gave us the standard so we could live up to it. And then he gave us civil government to be able to exercise our religious liberties, to try and live up to it, or to pursue it. As we've said, this is really the blueprint for American government. I passed out the handout last week, and if you didn't get that, I'm still working on that a little bit, but I like how that all on one page, it talks about the Declaration, the key statement in the Declaration, and the biblical basis behind it. Very, very powerful. I don't want you to leave this series having any questions about how that section of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We have inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and for this reason God instituted government. That's like a statement of belief. It's like a statement that you'd find in a church doctrinal statement. And we had that summarized on that handout. Very important that you all understand that and internalize what that means. It's huge. It's the blueprint behind America. And it really only works if the American people are a moral and civil people. Our founders even told us that. If we walk away from that religious standard, our government won't work. We have walked away from it. And what do we find with our government?
It's not working.
It's not working. So really this isn't a surprise to us. The next point, really, if you think about evangelism, and I mention this because one of the pushbacks I get from pastors and church leaders is, well, you know, we just don't think that getting involved in the public arena is really our focus. Our focus is really the Great Commission, is to share the gospel. And the point we made is, well, yes, that is our focus. That was the focus in the Old Testament. It's still the focus. The only difference is, instead of God building up the nation of Israel so that the nations of the world could see Israel and understand who God was because of how they were living, instead of that, we now have the gospel, which is a very important understanding, and we were told to what? Go out. So it's a go strategy to evangelize the world versus a what? A stay strategy. That's really the only difference. We're still supposed to evangelize. They were doing it in the Old Testament. We're supposed to do it in the New Testament. But there's one more thing. If you really want the ideal situation for evangelism, it'd be nice if you didn't have to worry about your neighbor coming over and stealing your food, or robbing you, or killing you. It's sort of like the Nehemiah situation. Remember when Nehemiah and the Israelites were rebuilding the wall? What did they have in one hand? A trowel, and right, they're building a wall. What was in the other hand? The sword. It's no way to build a wall, but that's what they had to do because they had enemies around them that were trying to prevent that. So God gives us government to give us a measure of stability and civility so that we can all sort of take a deep breath and consider, you know, the great questions of life. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? That's the ideal situation for evangelism. God gives us government so that we can live, so we can aspire to live holy and righteous lives, and so that all men can come to a saving knowledge of the gospel. He tells us that in 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 2. And somehow we miss that point. So if you're thinking, well, I don't want to spend much time, or I don't think that's important, well, God thinks it's important. He gave it to us so that we could have stable societies and that we could evangelize in that context and be able to more easily win the lost to Christ. The other thing we talked about was this idea of church and state. You know, we hear a lot about the Constitution saying that separation of church and state is critical. It's not in the Constitution. We went through that. But we also talked about the fact that the real point here is over-control from either the church or the state. And it all comes back to our primary religious liberty, which is that God wants us to each be able to go on our own personal faith journey and make a decision, unencumbered by what the state's trying to get you to do or what the church is telling you should believe. Both are bad. We've seen that certainly in the last 2,000 years. We talked about the medieval church, where they had inquisitions. They would torture people. Did anyone go back and look up on Google? I keep mentioning to you to go do it. Look up Inquisition, the medieval church, and look at some of the ways they used to torture people that had what the church at the time felt were heretical beliefs. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable what we used to do in the name of Christ. Over control of the church is bad. Over control of the state is bad. What we want to do is find that middle ground where we do what? We respect the religious and civil liberties of everyone so that they can freely choose. And then lastly, we said it's the stewardship responsibility of the church to hold up these truths so that our posterity can enjoy the same liberties that we've enjoyed. And we're very dangerously close to losing that. I'm very concerned about my grandchildren having the same kinds of religious freedom that I have had.
Won't happen.
Unless things change, it won't happen.
It won't change.
So Well, anything's possible.
I hate to be a pessimist, but I'm sorry.
It'll take a miracle. I agree with you on that point. So let's move on. So tonight, what are we going to talk about? Well, I've got 3 questions that I want to talk through. First of all, who is this struggle really between? I bring this up because, I don't know about you guys, but I get really frustrated when I talk to people that believe differently than I do. And I'm saying that a bit selfishly. And I can respect people having different points of view. And the reality is, as the reason that you're here, is a lot of folks just don't have the information. So it's one of the reasons why we're putting this on. We want people to have the information. And my experience has been, and my belief is that there are an awful lot of people out there that when they get the information, will have a change of heart and change their mind. I do think there's about 20% of the American population that will probably not change their mind, and that's fine. 80% would be great.
Yeah.
We don't need 80%. We just need a little bit more than 50%. But listen, it's not right that we just look at our neighbor and feel like they're the enemy. Because in most cases, they're not. They're just uninformed. And we need to inform them. But there is an enemy. And we need to know who that is. Another question, what will be the result if the church remains largely disengaged? We'll talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, the key question here, who has the most to gain by marginalizing the church from the public arena? Because that's what's happening. The church is allowing itself to be marginalized from the public square, preventing our influence from having an effect on a lot of the policies that are going on. Who has the most to gain from that? That's what we're going to take a look at. So I want to start it this way. I see a lot of experience in the audience, and for those of you who have voted in perhaps 4 to 6 presidential elections, maybe more. I'm trying to do the math in my head here. For those of us who have been voting for perhaps 40 or 50 or 60 years, some of you maybe, we've seen some wobble, right? Some political wobble. We've had Democratic presidents, we've had Republican presidents, we've had Democratic Congresses, lots of Democratic Congresses. It was a miracle when the Republicans took over in '94 after about a 40-year stint, I think it was. But for the most part, we've seen what I would call normal wobble. But my question is that what we're seeing now? Are we seeing normal wobble in the political system? And my answer would be no. In the broader scope of world events, we need to recognize that there's a battle going on. It's a spiritual battle. And ultimately, this is a battle between God and Satan. Now, some of you in the audience, or maybe some that are watching the video, might be thinking, you mean you really believe that there's a literal Satan? That there's a real person? And the answer is yeah. We do. Listen, if you're a Christian, if you accepted Christ as your Savior, let's just look at what He said. First of all, what did Christ say about the Old Testament? It was all true. The least stroke of the pen, He said, was all true. We get our information about Satan, the fall of Satan, which we're going to take a look at here, from the Old Testament. And then there was what He said when He was conducting His ministry. Did He talk about Satan at all? Was there any encounters between Jesus and Satan?
Sure.
There were. They're well documented.
He cast out demons.
And then what about the New Testament writers? Did they have anything to say about Satan? And the answer is yes. Satan's all over the place. In fact, and this is one of the reasons why I have this series that I do on angels, because, and a lot of it's on Satan, is we just simply lose track about really the plot behind Operation Planet Earth. What's the plot? Well, go back into eternity past. Okay, this is before creation. Was Satan originally a good guy or a bad guy?
Good.
He was originally a good guy. And we're going to look at some of that. But there was some confrontation. There was a fall of something. There was a rebellion. We don't know all the details. We're going to look at some of it tonight. And God cast Satan out of the third heaven and threw out a third of the angelic host with him. They are his henchmen. Ever since then, Satan has been trying to mess with God's plan for mankind. Specifically, Satan's been trying to thwart God's redemptive plan for mankind. In the garden, we had fellowship. That fellowship was broken. That's like the first 5 minutes in a great movie. You know, we watch great movies. Lots of us watch great movies. What happens in the first 5 minutes? You get the plot. You sort of get the gist of what's happening. Usually there's a scene where you understand what the problem is. And the rest of the movie is usually about how that problem will get resolved. And there's usually a good guy and there's usually a what? A bad guy that they call the protagonist. A movie isn't a good movie unless there's a what? A bad guy. And so Operation Planet Earth is really a drama that's been playing out for at least 6,000 years, maybe longer, between our good guy, Jesus, and the bad guy. Now the great thing is, do we know how this story is going to end?
Yeah.
We absolutely do, with certainty. We're in the midst of a difficult battle, but we know who's going to win the war. And that should give us tremendous hope and confidence, especially when you think about what we might have to do in our lifetimes to defend our liberties. Hey, you know, I'm really at the point, I'm secure in my faith that whatever happens, happens. To live is Christ, to die is what? Gain. So that's the big drama that's going on. And so, number one, we wanted to talk about this because it's important that people understand the big picture. This is the mother of all big pictures. And unfortunately, churches don't talk about this. How many of you have heard a sermon from the pulpit about Satan, the fall of Satan, what he's doing? Very few. I've never heard one in my life. The only reason I know so much about it is because my mentor drugged me through, about 5 hours of the study of angels. And I'm so glad he did. Because otherwise, I wouldn't know at all about what's going on here. And so number one, it's important that we understand the big picture here. Number two, it's really important that we don't get upset with our neighbors as we're trying to offer them the real information. They're not the enemy in a lot of cases. I would say in most cases, they're not the enemy. So listen, we're in a battle. And if you're in a battle, what do you need to know? You need to know who your enemy is, and then you need to know what? What about your enemy? What his tactics are. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. What's at stake? The souls of mankind are at stake. If you step back, that's what's at stake. God is dealing with Satan. We know God's going to win. But what Satan's trying to do is thwart God's redemptive plan for mankind. And he wants to take over the world. And when I say the world, I mean the earth and the first and second heaven. So we don't exactly know all the barriers here, but from what we can piece together from Scripture, there's a first, a second, and a third heaven. The first heaven is, like if I threw this remote out and John caught it, that would be in the first heaven. The second heaven is the stars that you can see. The third heaven is where God is. And so somehow Satan has access because he's accusing us on an ongoing basis. He can approach the bar, if you will. There's a barrier. He can't enter into the third heaven, but he can accuse us to God. That's what he was doing in the book of what? Job. The whole story is about Satan having his way with Job, or trying to. And so God has given Satan a measure of control in the first and second heaven and the planet. So what does Satan want to do? He wants to take over the whole thing. What's stopping him from doing that? What nation on the planet is the foothold for religious liberty, freedom, and evangelism?
America.
It's us. If Satan can bring down America, then he's, in his eyes, won the battle. But again, we know how this is going to. So don't lose hope, no matter what happens. But this is what he's trying to do. This is not a haphazard attack. This is a systematic assault following a very predictable pattern, and this is what we're going to take a look at tonight. So first off, how do we know about Satan? Well, there's two passages in the Old Testament that teach us about Satan. One is in Ezekiel and one is in Isaiah. We know in eternity past that Satan, formerly named Lucifer, which is the shining one, was actually in God's inner circle. He was his greatest angel. He was like the chief of staff. He wasn't some, knucklehead running around. He was God's second in command. Ezekiel gives us some very interesting information about Satan's fall, and it's told from the vantage point of God. It's God narrating what happened. And when you read the passage there in between verses 11 and 19, it actually, at first it's like, is he talking about an earthly king? Because it sort of sounds like, but as you read into it, you realize he's not talking about an earthly king. He's talking about Satan. And it's a lament. If you read, we don't have time to go through it now, but if you read the passage, you'll see God is lamenting. He is very disappointed that his chosen angel has rebelled. Now, the Isaiah passage is a little different. The Isaiah passage is almost like a first-person account of how Satan was thinking when he rebelled against God. It's often referred to as the 5 I wills. And this is Satan basically saying, I will do this. I am not going to respect your authority. I will do what? I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. So in this account in Isaiah, we get sort of what's happening in the mind of Satan. I love these two passages. I'm so thankful that God gives us such a complete account. He's telling us what happened from his vantage point and from Satan's vantage point. And I would encourage you to read through those sections. You learn a lot about Satan. And I can tell you, as someone I've taught this series on angels and about Satan, it's like a 12-week kind of thing. And I've done it several times, and I got to tell you, when you go through it, especially when you're teaching it, this guy's really bad. He really is. It sort of chokes me up a little bit just how evil this guy is. I feel like I've met him a couple of times when I go through this stuff, and it's not... Anyway, so what do we learn about Satan? Well, I just want to give you a few of the names, and this isn't even the whole list. But these are names that are given to Satan throughout Scripture. Notice who's writing this. So it's John, it's Matthew, it's John again, it's Paul. These are all heavyweights giving us information. Look at the names. Satan is what? He is our adversary. He is our accuser. He is intrinsically evil. He is our opponent. He's the prince of demons. He's powerful. He's a destroyer. He's the earthly authority. He leads people to eternal death. That is his goal. He wants to take as many souls to the lake of fire as he can. He perverts the truth. He opposes believers before God, which is essentially what he did in the book of Job. And there's more. I couldn't get it all on the slide. And how much more do you need? Is this guy bad or what?
Bad dude.
This is our enemy. He is a really bad guy. So how does Satan do battle with us in 2013? Essentially, he is focusing on the battlefield of truth. This is what he's doing. He's trying to pervert and change the truth. His focus is on academia and government. I think it's no surprise. We know what's happening in the educational system. Our kids in primary grades, they're not getting the education even that I used to get. And we know what's happening in the colleges. They're not, basically anarchy is being taught in a lot of our premier colleges that were originally founded based on the gospel of Christ. And it's unbelievable when you read the 1636 student hand guide from Harvard. And look at what's happening in Harvard now. It's unbelievable. So what does Satan try and get us to believe? Here's what he's got sort of he starts at the top of the list, and he says, first thing, there's no God. All the founders were deists. They didn't believe in God. There's no God. Don't worry about it. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. If he can get you to agree that there's no God, he's already won. If you insist on believing in God, he'll give you a bunch of gods. Pick one. You've got all kinds. Is it your career? Is it sports? You know, this one's a sensitive one for me because I see so many families getting sucked into sports and these travel teams that play on Sunday. And they never make it to church. That was a little bit of a struggle for us. Of my 4 kids, 2 of them were very into sports. And there was just a handful of times where we missed church. But my opinion is that when you're growing up, part of going to church is like brushing your teeth. You just sort of have to get in the habit. And let's face it, they don't remember much of anything at that age in church anyway, but there's this, I do remember a few things. I'm used to going. It almost doesn't feel right getting up Sunday morning and not being in church. And that's a great place to start. But if you have kids that are chronically involved in sports that take them away from church Sunday morning at a minimum, that's a problem. That's creating an idol and pulling them away. Satan loves that. He loves to see our kids get sucked into these extracurricular activities that take them out of church. Many of them grow up thinking they're going to become, a major league football, a baseball player, or in the NFL or whatever. And we all know the odds of that are pretty slim. But we get sucked into it. Satan loves it. Okay, let's say you insist on the God of the Bible. Satan's got to have a plan of attack. First he's going to tell you that, that Bible, there's all kinds of errors in it. All kinds of errors. You actually believe in a literal creation? Really? That's crazy talk. And how about Satan? How do you, this is Satan. Basically, he's brainwashed a lot of our country into believing there's no Satan. It's brilliant, actually. Convincing someone that you don't exist. That's what he's done. Or he'll say it's partially true. Oh, you can interpret it any way you want. What's it mean to you? My mentor used to talk about Bible studies where you'd go in and people would sit in a circle and you'd say, okay, let's read this verse, and go around and say, well, what's that verse mean to you? And he called that pooled ignorance. And his standard for teaching was, nope, you need to go in with a set of notes. You need to know what you're going to say. You need to tell them the truth. And he was my mentor, so he was a good standard for me to follow. But I never forgot that, pooled ignorance, because I was in some of those Bible studies, and that's what it was. Okay, let's assume you insist that the Bible's true. The next plan of attack is we're going to try and convince you that Jesus was not really God. We will chip away at the fact that the person and work of Christ isn't what the Bible says. He was a good teacher, but he wasn't fully God. Or he became God. Or if I can get you to believe that God's really not completely interested in the affairs of men, that's deism. The definition of deism is, I believe in a God, but he sort of wound everything up and took off, and he's not really, you can pray all you want, but he's not going to listen to it. That's what deism is. That's one of the charges that the secular side of our society levy against our founders. They said, oh, they were all deists. Or, oh, they were all slave-holding property owners, and anything they can to discredit them. Thank God we have a written record of what these guys believed. And I wish we had time. There is no way. Even Franklin, who I hear people claim was a deist, during the middle of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, they had been working for 4 weeks. They were not making progress. It was Franklin who raised his hand and said, you know what, the older I get, the more I realize that nothing happens unless God's in it. I think we should take a break and pray.
Oh, wow.
And that's what they did.
Wow.
Paraphrase.
Very nice.
They prayed and they came back, and guess what? They wrapped things up in about 6 weeks. The whole Constitution. Washington said it was a miracle.
It wasn't just a little prayer either.
No, these guys, I don't know the details, but there was several. Congress opened in prayer all the time.
Right.
There's a famous picture of the first prayer back in 1774, I think, when they first met. And that was a heavy-duty prayer. There's a picture of it where guys are, on the floor prostrate, and they were serious about this stuff.
Right.
But anyway, if Satan can get you to believe that, Jesus isn't really the Son of God, he's one. Or he'll do this. He'll attack the means of salvation. This is really frustrating, isn't it? Because there are a lot of people who say they are Christians, say they believe in the Bible, say they believe in Jesus, but you ask them, you ask them that question. If he died tonight, what would you say? And they don't really have an answer. They're confused. Or the answer is, I think I've lived my life. I think I've done a lot of good. And, they're on the works track. And we all know that's not going to do it. You're saved by grace through faith. There's nothing you can do to earn your salvation. Nothing. But if Satan can get you to believe that you can work your way to heaven, or that don't worry about it, God's not going to send anyone to hell. How can a loving God send anyone to hell? Don't worry. You're fine. He's one there. And unfortunately, that's a lot of churches in America today. And then here's the last one. And you can see how these sort of go down, right? The last one is, okay, you believe in all this stuff. You can answer the question. If you die tonight, you can rattle it off. You get it. You're saved by grace through faith. Nothing you can do to earn your salvation. The next thing he'll do is he'll try and discourage Christians from getting into the meat. That's why we really are appreciative that you guys came out. Because it shows you guys want to get into the meat. That is excellent. We commend you for that. A lot of Christians don't want to get into the meat. Quick one?
Quick one is what you're talking about. We've got a Sunday school lesson this week, and they're saying, what was the very first tactic that Satan used with the serpent? He said to Eve, God didn't really mean.
Yeah.
Don't eat.
He deceived her.
Yeah.
He rephrased things.
And it's so similar to, they said, they couldn't really mean that this pill you take that causes an abortion the next day is really killing a baby, or gay marriage, or any things like that. It's God didn't really mean that. It's no different than the deception of that.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, tomorrow's the National Day of Prayer. And I'm focused on the family today. You can listen to it at 9:30 on 93.7 tonight. They have prayers that were recorded on their answering machine where people called in. And the most moving prayers were all people praying that people on the school boards and in our education system and in our colleges.
Praying for our leaders.
Yeah, praying for the leaders in control to make the decisions in our schools and, of course, our government.
Yep. So let me keep going. I see our time is slipping away. I'm long-winded. That's the problem when I'm not having to hold a mic and my arm's getting tired. So what does God say about a nation that turns away? God's actually pretty clear about this. Romans 1:18-20, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power, His divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. God's made His existence clear to mankind, where we don't have an excuse. That's Paul. He's sharing that with us. They just don't have an excuse. Let's keep reading. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the images made to look like mortal man, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. Once a society turns away from God, He will give them over to the sinful desires of their heart. This is step one. And yes, we're going on a 3-step process here. This is step one of what happens. Step two. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Without repentance, God will give a society over to shameful lusts. This is step 2. But it gets worse. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind, to do what ought not be done. They become filled with every kind of, listen to this list, wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless, and the list goes on. I just ran out of room on the page. And they approve of those who do such things. The next step is for God to give the society over to a depraved mind. This is step 3. So let's put this all together. The great battles between God and Satan is over the souls of mankind. Satan uses many strategies to confuse individuals and nations to turn away. And Romans 1 details how this works. And unfortunately, we see this pattern in the United States. So let's connect a few dots so you understand your history. In terms of key events, in 1947, Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court redefined church and state from in the First Amendment. They completely redefined it. We mentioned this last week. From over 150 years of precedent, with no rationale. After numerous court challenges where the correct definition was upheld, citing Jefferson's letter. Remember, we talked about that. All of a sudden, 1947, they completely reversed and redefined the First Amendment. This is the amendment where we have our freedom of speech and no formal establishment of a state religion.
Excuse me, what happened? What caused them to do that?
It was the progressive movement in the early 1900s and then the conscious turning away from studying the Constitution and always going back to the Constitution for ruling on cases. That was the way it had been done. They moved away from that to case law and the idea of precedence. So lawyers in law school, they stopped always going to the Constitution and they started having the law students read case law so they understood how other cases were ruled, and they looked for ways to continue to rule in a more progressive fashion. By the 1930s, when Roosevelt was president, he was president for, he was elected 4 times president. How many years?
Yeah,
13 years? 14?
times.
Yeah, he didn't serve 16 years. He was 16 minus 3. 13 years.
Well,
So how many Supreme Court justices did that progressive president put in place? That were in place in 1947. That's how we got to that point. It's a great question. Thank you for asking. So what is that? What's the cultural trend? What really happened there? What really happened was a rejection of God among the ruling class. They rejected God. They also redefined freedom. We talked about that last week. Freedom from fear. Freedom to have a great job and you know, whatever amenities. You have a right to have a house. You have a right to all the amenities that all the rich people have. Instead of the right to pursue these things, which is a huge difference. Just a matter of time, 1962, they banned school prayer. In 1963, they took the Bible out of the classroom. What happened? Well, you had the sexual revolution. Humanism, secular humanism, was on the rise. I remember this growing up. Environmentalism started to become important. And then as recently in the last 10 to 20 years, sexual expression and reproductive rights are now the defense for abortion. And this human-animal equality, this idea that animals are equal to humans. That's what's out there. That's what biocentric environmentalism is. And we have several generations of children who have never heard an adult read Scripture. There's your 3 steps. That's what's happened. So, how does God deal with Satan? We just talked about the war. We talked about Satan's strategies. We talked about what's happened in America. How does God deal with this? Now, we all know God could just so, right, and take care of this. But he doesn't do that. What does he do? If you step back and look, here's what God does. He raises up individuals and nations to basically do two things. Number one, build a kingdom. This is evangelize, this is disciple, this is shepherding, this is the ABCs of church life. Most churches do this pretty well. I think Springdale does this real well. But here's the second thing God does. He raises up nations and individuals to contend with the enemies of God. Or said differently, to keep evil in check. He wants us to do that. What stopped Hitler in World War II and fascism from spreading across the globe? Who did God raise up to do that? It was the United States. There's no question. You know, in hindsight, we can look and see this. It's just crystal clear. This is what God does. And he raises up individuals to do this too. And these are the guys in the Bible that basically have done this. We have clear record that this is what they did. I love David, for instance. What did David do when Goliath came out and was challenging the armies of God? Who was Goliath? He was not just a hoodlum. He was a representative of Satan, challenging the armies of God. And we know this because what did David say? You know, you come at me, blah, 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 but I come at you in the name of the Lord. What did God do? He raised up a young man to deal with the enemies of God. That's what he does. He does that now. Here's a modern example. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller. Many of you have probably heard of Bonhoeffer. Any of you read his book? If you've not read Bonhoeffer, just put it on your book list. It's a great book. The guy was amazing. He was probably one of the top 5 leading theologians in the first half of the last century. He was really an amazing guy. I'd love to talk about him, but we don't have time. Niemöller was a World War II veteran in the German army and became a pastor afterwards. These guys were contemporaries. So, what happened when Germany was, when Hitler took over in the early 30s? Bonhoeffer saw what was happening. He was a young man at the time. I want to say he was in his late 20s. But he could see what was happening. And he warned his peers, most of whom did nothing. He, however, worked behind the scenes, opposing the forces of evil. He was actually involved in one of the plots to assassinate Hitler. He was a spy. He was doing all kinds of things. Even though he was one of the leading clergymen. I mean, pick a leading clergyman. It'd be like Billy Graham getting involved because he saw what was going on. Why would he think that? This is what he said. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. So, very quick, I'm running low on time.
Just wasn't he safe in America and he chose to go back and take it on full strength?
Yep. He is such a neat guy. I wish we had time to talk about it. Then he was in England and he chose to go back and deal with it. I mean, he saw what was happening. So, what about Niemöller? Niemöller was a pastor and peer. He initially spoke out as Hitler grabbed more and more power. And I read of an encounter where Niemöller actually challenged Hitler face to face in the early 30s. He ended up in a concentration camp, and he survived the war. Years later, he summarized what happened from his vantage point. This is what he said. They came for the tradesmen. I didn't say anything because I wasn't a tradesman. When they came for the socialists, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a socialist. When they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one left to speak. Now, this is a guy who didn't necessarily sit the thing out. He actually, like I said, he confronted Hitler face to face on one occasion. I'm still trying to confirm that, but that's what I read in one book. My point is, he looked at what he did, which in his mind was not enough. And he said, I didn't do enough. I didn't do enough. I didn't speak. So, this is my last slide. The nature of the conflict. America's in cultural decline, we know that. Increasing levels of assault on Christianity from the government, the media, and the church is disengaged. This is a cosmic battle. Let's not lose sight of that. We know who the enemy is. We know how he operates. Satan's doing what he always does. He lies, deceives, and he focuses on individuals and nations. He is the one that has the most to gain from the fall of America. And this is what really torques me off, because I'm not going to sit down while, I'm sort of feeling like David. I'm having a bit of a David moment. I'm not going to sit down. Come on. Question is, how will we respond? Are we at a moment in time when we are called to keep evil in check? And we're being asked by God to stand up and say something. I believe we are. I don't believe he left. I guess he was so depressed he left. I don't believe that it's too late. In fact, I anticipate things to get worse. And I think it'll be an opportunity. Because, unfortunately, we have to be reminded every once in a while. And there's nothing like getting your head in a vice to remind you that you're not living up. And what happens after that? Usually there's a tremendous opportunity for revival, and we need to be ready for that. And so this is, again, why we're presenting this series. We want you to have the information to be able to say, listen, let's talk about America. Let's talk about our faith. Let's talk about our responsibility as Christians. It's a great story. American founding is an incredibly rich story. A lot of people just haven't heard. So, we okay for a few questions?
Yeah.
I think we're...
Yeah. Is Satan working in our government? And the reason I ask, we got a president that does not believe in the Constitution.
He also said,
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a politically charged question. I think what I would say is, we know that there are unbelievers in the government.
Yes.
We know that there are believers in the government who probably don't fully understand the founding. After all, we have lots of pastors who don't fully understand the founding.
Yes.
We know Satan uses deception and chaos and confusion. I mean, just watch a news program where they've got multiple guests being interviewed. I mean, it's like, that is, Satan's using all that. So we know that Satan's using confusion to cause American government to be in gridlock. We know he's doing that. And so as a result, we're not really solving our problems. We're not really addressing the issues. So I think that's how I'd answer it.
And what do you think about him not believing in the Constitution, though?
Well, again, I'd rather not get into what he believes, what he doesn't believe. We can talk about it as a sidebar. I think by his actions, it certainly appears that he has a different viewpoint of the Constitution than the founders intended, as does much of the Democratic Party. And by the way, a lot of the Republican Party doesn't have the original view either. So if you think of, there's problems in both parties. But I'd say there's more of a problem right now in the Democratic Party, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because I think a two-party system is good for our country. I just think we've just gone way off track, and both parties are in trouble. Was there one more question?
You're right.
What do you do when you try your best to tell someone about God and tell them some of the things you learned over the time and with the Bible, and they don't want to listen?
So number one, we got to pray. At the end of the day, someone said, this is a God-sized problem. Don't feel like you have to convince them. Send them the links to the videos.
They turn you off.
That's fine. Here's the unfortunate statistic. I may get this wrong, but it's like only 1 in 6 adults who grew up not knowing Christ will convert to Christianity. It's a low percentage. This is why we need to get our kids when they're young. And the adults, fortunately, there are a lot of adults who may never come to believe, but will be persuaded by the history if we get them to see that. Independence, Christian independence, if you will, or cultural Christians. But you know what? It all comes down to prayer. I really do believe that. We need to pray for our country. We need to do what God told us to do. Pray for our country, pray for our leaders.